Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. The program is about to begin. At this time, please turn off all electronic devices. Please refrain from using flash photography during the program. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. Brad Smith.
Yeah, I'll say. Yeah. Right over here, Brad. Good evening, everyone. My name's John Highbush, and I have the honor of being the Executive Director of the Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute. Thanks so much for coming this evening. If you would, in honor of our men and women in uniform who defend our freedom around the world, please stand and join me for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Please be seated. So, I'll set the stage for you. It's late in the evening and you're scrolling through Facebook, Instagram, what have you, on your Microsoft Surface, of course. But you spot a video posted by a news outlet from the leader of one of America's global adversaries. You turn up the volume and listen. "We are declaring war on the United States of America. All Americans brace for war," says this foreign head of state, direct to camera. It's really him. You don't want to believe it, but there's no question. Other news outlets aren't reporting on it yet, so you start anxiously searching the internet for more information. It could take an hour or more for our government, or any government, to correct the record and inform the public that this video is a deep fake, an ultra-realistic but phony video made possible by artificial intelligence. And in that hour, the world order could be turned upside down. When we think of the threats of the digital age, we're accustomed to thinking about what we've experienced: hacking, ransomware, stolen files, leaked communications, but that's just the beginning. Or we think of works of fiction from 70 years ago, like George Orwell's dystopian masterwork, 1984. 1984 was in the mind of our guest speaker a lot lately. Last year, Microsoft President Brad Smith wrote that with the rapid advancement of facial recognition software and its potential surveillance uses, to quote Brad, "We must ensure that the year 2024 doesn't look like a page from the novel 1984. Now, in his own book, Brad wants all of us, private citizens, public officials, to grapple with those threats and many others, the ones that sound like fiction but now are all too real, as well as the challenges that we have yet to imagine. The book, Tools and Weapons, The Promise and Peril of the Digital Age, it offers a timely reckoning, but also real reason for hope. Brad Smith leads a team of 1,400 business, legal, corporate affairs professionals who work in 56 countries around the world. And he operates by a simple core belief: when your technology changes the world, you bear responsibility to help address the world that you have helped to create. And he really means it. Just this morning, front page, Washington Post, New York Times. Headlines blare. Iran-linked group tried to hack a US 2020 campaign, Microsoft says. Indeed, Microsoft recently uncovered a campaign believed to be tied to the Iranian government, one that attempted to identify, attack, and breach email addresses belonging to US presidential campaigns, government officials, and several journalists. We're honored to have Brad at the Reagan Library this evening for what is an extraordinarily timely and relevant discussion. And we're honored to welcome all of you to be part of that. Brad will be joined tonight on stage by David Sanger, New York Times, incredibly respected New York Times national security correspondent, who in his 36 years of reporting has been on 3 Pulitzer Prize winning teams. In addition to being a best-selling author, he also teaches on national security at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Mr. Brad Smith and Mr. David Sanger.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Well, thank you very much for that introduction, Brad. Great to be back here with you. We've done these conversations now for on and off on this topic for probably 15, 20 years, so it's great to be here and be with this really terrific book, Tools and Weapons.
Thank you, and thanks to all of you for coming and being here this evening.
Yeah. So let's start with the news of the day that you just heard, because it fits so clearly into the topic you've been writing about. You folks turned out a lengthy blog post this morning that described recent activity, August and September, for a well-known Iranian-linked group that we believe to be government-backed, because if you were in Iran and you were running a hacking group that wasn't government-backed, it probably wouldn't be so healthy, right? The attack was fascinating because while it went after some familiar targets, it also went after at least one presidential campaign, which you guys did not name.
Correct.
So tell us a little bit about why it is that Microsoft even feels a responsibility to come out and declare these things. You could just call up your customers and say, we think there's an attempt and we think we've blocked it, but we'll need your help and we can go do this. But there's no particular reason that you have to get out and publicly accuse the Iranian government.
It's a really interesting question, David, and I think we've been on a bit of a journey as a company, and it's a journey that we talk about, Carol Ann Brown, my co-author, and I in our book, obviously not with today's pages in terms of what happened, but it's been unfolding for the last couple of years. In the wake of the WannaCry attack, which was in May of 2017, which was just devastating because it disabled more than 300,000 computers in more than 150 countries in a day. We joined with some others, and we ended up thinking it was important to name names. In that case, it was a group connected with the North Korean government. It was the same group responsible for the prior attack on Sony. Last year, we actually had a bigger step in the sense that it really required more thought. And it was a sort of internal thought process that we talk about in the book. But last August, we went public and said that a group connected with the Russian military was responsible for attacks on some congressional campaigns and against 2 prominent, basically Republican-connected think tanks, the International Republican Institute and the Hudson Institute. And then today, obviously, as you know, we this morning published this account, and we named a group that we codenamed Phosphorus that's connected, most people conclude, with the Iranian government. So we've asked ourselves, why name names? And as we've really thought about it, I think we've come to the view that if we want this to stop, we have to have the courage to be more public and attribute the attacks to the attackers. It goes back in part to your book. I mean, you have this amazing title, The Perfect Weapon. And as you explain in your book, David, the reason a cyber weapon is the perfect weapon is because it can too easily basically be fired with impunity. You can try to hide the source of the attack. We've developed an increasingly sophisticated ability through our Threat Intelligence Center to detect these attacks and to identify their source. And these, I just believe, are fundamental threats to our democracy. I believe they are fundamental threats to many democratic countries around the world. And if we want them to stop, we have to stand up. We're all going to have to stand up, but we can't stand up if we can't name the attacker.
Well, it's a fascinating thing to watch as a reporter because I started my reporting career actually early in the Reagan era, in 1982, right after I graduated from college. And at that point, almost every major attack that would come at the United States, you would at first expect the government of the United States to see. What's fascinating about the attacks that we've gone through in the cyber age, twofold. First of all, we have a perfect record among U.S. intelligence on the major attacks on the U.S. You mentioned some of them: Sony, Office of Personnel Management, WannaCry, which is in here. And our perfect record is that we have predicted absolutely none of them, right? And the second is that if you want to get granular information about it, I don't usually bother calling the NSA or the Department of Homeland Security. I'm much more likely to call your digital threat group, which I was talking to at midday today, or Google's equivalent of it, or Apple's equivalent of it, or JP Morgan Chase's equivalent if it's in the financial area, or one of these others. And so we're in this odd world right now where the primary line of defense is actually you guys. And the role of our government in defending against these is extremely unclear.
That's a really interesting thing to just reflect upon, because if you think about the history of human conflict, for many millennia, human conflict took place either on land or on the sea. And then in the early 20th century, it moved into the air. Ultimately, people recognized it could move into space. So you had 4 potential planes of conflict. The 21st century has seen the invention of a 5th plane of conflict, cyberspace. It's different from all the other 4 in one key respect. Cyberspace is mostly owned and operated by the private sector. Yeah, because what you're really seeing when you see a cyber attack is an attack on data in a data center or on a server computer or a laptop or a phone, or the tapping or interception of a fiber optic cable. But when you think about all of those things, some of them might be owned and operated by a government, but more likely it's not. And most of it is actually owned and operated by big tech companies, although I'd also say that we're all part of cyberspace. If you have a phone in your pocket or in your purse, then you too are part of cyberspace, and the attack may be on you. But what that has
Or
led,
more likely, you are collateral damage.
Usually that's right, although I think in WannaCry, you could argue it was the potentially intended effect, and the same in NotPetya, which was against Ukraine. But what it means is that at a company like Microsoft, as we describe, we created a threat intelligence center. The Microsoft Threat Intelligence Center, or the acronym MYSTIC. And it may well be among, or even be the most sophisticated threat intelligence center for analyzing what's going on the internet. We get more than 6 trillion signals every day from devices and services around the world that are running our hardware or software. And so when you're able to sift through that with the benefits of artificial intelligence and the like, you can detect new attacks, you can detect trends. And from my vantage point, the good news is that increasingly we can actually identify who the attacker is. Not without a lot of work. Oftentimes we do our best work when we collaborate with other tech companies, as we described we did after WannaCry, because then you can take your respective sets of data, you can put them together, and you can determine whether you all come to the same conclusion. We definitely don't have the type of intelligence that a government has, in the sense that governments have human intelligence, meaning spies. We don't. But we have signals intelligence, we have data. And I think that creates a special responsibility on us. We approach it from the standpoint of the fact that we have customers, they use our software, they use our devices. More and more they place their data in our data centers. And so our first responsibility is to protect them. And we cannot protect them unless we focus on this kind of work.
But it was interesting today, you also didn't name them. You named the attacker, but you didn't name the victims. And you know, we spent a lot of time jousting with your folks today over, so which presidential campaign? Brad can't say this, if you believe the failing New York Times, it was actually President Trump's campaign that was hit by this. We don't think they did any particular damage. But tell us a little bit about why you don't name the victim.
Well, when you stop and think about it, we have a customer relationship with the victims. The reason that we know they've been attacked is because they are our customer, they're using our service. And we want to protect the confidentiality, or really I'll just say, hold true to the wishes of our customers. There are many days when I believe that the world would be better served if customers would be prepared to share their identity as victims. We describe in the book, where we were a victim a couple of years ago, and oftentimes when you're a victim of a cyber attack, you actually don't want to say anything about it, especially if you actually suffered some loss. You may be embarrassed by it. But it goes back to my view that the best way to solve the problem is to get it out in the open, hold the attackers accountable. But when we have these kinds of situations, what we will often do is reach out to customers, and we don't feel it's our right typically to share information about a customer's identity unless the customer is willing to let us do so.
But we've had moments, and of course our role in journalism is quite different than your role there, where we felt it necessary to out who some of the victims were, because some of them were companies that were holding your data and wanted to cover up the fact that they had lost your data. A prominent example of this, which you discuss some in the book, was the US government when it lost the clearance data on 22 million Americans through the Office of Personnel Management, which the Chinese intelligence services cleared out for a year before the US government even recognized that it was losing the data, right? So why shouldn't there be some laws in place or regulations in place that would require companies that are holding your healthcare data or your tax data or your security clearance data and require them to basically own up to what happened? Because they don't own the data. That belongs to everybody in this audience.
Yeah, I think that goes to some of the questions that people are talking about around the world increasingly about what are called data breaches. And it's like anything, you can put things into different categories. If I suffer a breach, if I'm attacked by a foreign government and they're able to access data that I have, well, if it's data I have, but it actually is data about you, then increasingly the law is saying, you know what, I at least have to notify you that there has been such a breach. Increasingly, especially in Europe, if you happen to be European, then under European law, I may well have to notify the data privacy regulator in a particular country. It may be the country in which you live. But if the only data that is lost is data that is mine and mine alone, then the law is much less likely to put the burden on me to disclose that publicly. But the real question you're asking, I think, is an important one. When do we want this kind of information to be made more public so the public as a whole has more knowledge about what's going on? Generally, I think we're at a point in time where we need at least some more transparency. I don't think that answers every question, because I think people have some countervailing rights as well. But it just goes back to a core belief. You can't really solve a problem if no one knows it exists. You can't solve a problem if you can't bring people together and talk about it. So if we want to solve this problem, we've got to get more facts out into the open.
One of the groups that in some ways was the earliest to recognize they had vulnerability, and in some ways the slowest to respond to it, was the US government and the Defense Department. And you tell a great story in the book about Ronald Reagan, who goes off and, of course, is watching a movie one night with Nancy, and comes down and begins to ask the chairman of the Joint Chiefs some uncomfortable questions about what he had just seen in the movie. So tell us a little bit about this.
It is one of the stories that makes us smile. For Carol Ann and me, we had the chance to work on it. We had the chance to interview people who were connected to it. First of all, I think it's a great lesson. I think success in life often goes not to the people who are the first to have the right answers, but to people who ask the right questions. And so in 1983, I believe it was, the movie War Games came out. Some of you I can see are nodding. Oh yeah, I remember that movie. For those of you who don't or who never saw it, it was actually one of Matthew Broderick's first films. He was a teenager when it was created. And he basically played a high school student who, right when computers were starting to become popular, had this fancy computer system in his bedroom, and he was looking for a way to hack into different computer systems in the hopes of finding a game he could play. Well, in the script of the movie, he hacked his way into a supercomputer of the Pentagon.
We all know this could never happen.
Yeah. and he looked at this list of games that could be played and go, this is fantastic. These are great games. And he could play chess, he could play checkers, or he could play thermonuclear war. So he said, I'm going to play thermonuclear war. And he started playing it. But because he had hacked in, the computer itself didn't think it was a game, and it embarked on a process of preparing to launch nuclear missiles to literally start a thermonuclear war. Well, as you would expect, I don't think it's a spoiler alert after this many decades, there was no thermonuclear war. But interestingly, President and Mrs. Reagan often liked to watch movies at Camp David on the weekend. And by great coincidence, one of the two writers of the film, a fellow named Larry Lasker in Los Angeles, knew the Reagans. He had seen Mrs. Reagan. And so the film was sent to Camp David, and the president and the first lady watched it the very first night after it aired. And we also interviewed one of the White House staffers who was with them in the room. And he said the lights went back on, and the president looked around, and they were like, oh my gosh, could this happen? And interestingly, the next week there was a meeting at the White House. It had 2 or 3 cabinet secretaries. It had the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And the president turned to the chairman and said, have you all seen this movie? And everybody was like, no, we haven't seen this movie. So he described the movie, and then he said, could this happen? And another great lesson in life, I think, stems from this. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff didn't just say, oh, no, don't worry about it. He said, I'll go ask. And a week later, he came back and he said, ooh, it's actually worse than it was shown in the movie. And out of that episode, two really important things happened. The first was the first national security order to really harden the computer defenses of the Pentagon and the government. And the second was the passage of a law that is still very important today. It's called the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. And basically what that does is it makes it a criminal offense to do what Matthew Broderick did in the movie. It's a fascinating account of how, sort of life can imitate art in that case. It's a fascinating account of how those first questions set the nation on a course to really address cybersecurity protection. And then it's just this amazing reminder. Now it's 2019, it's no longer the 1980s, and we have more defenses than we did, but the problem is much, much, much more substantial than it was than when it was first imagined in that film.
Well, it's fascinating because when you read the indictment of Julian Assange that the US government issued earlier this year, he's still being held by the Brits. What was the first charge he had that came up? Violation of the Computer
Fraud and Abuse
Act.
Yeah, basically, if you access a computer that does not belong to you, that is secured in a particular way, and without the permission of the owner, then you are potentially violating that law.
That's right. So let's spin this forward a little bit. So the Pentagon half learned its lesson, but by the fall of 2008, somebody spread some USBs around a parking lot in the Middle East that ended up putting a Russian-made virus into Defense Department computers that were abroad. And that turned into a real wake-up call that led to the creation of US Cyber Command. Mm-hmm. And now US Cyber Command is in a quite different place. It's a full command, the way Central Command is, runs the Middle East, and Northern Command defends the United States, and so forth. But it also is involved now in a strategy called persistent presence, where the government goes deep into computer systems around the world to watch for attacks that might be gathering. And then it makes a decision about whether to act preemptively, the way we acted against the Iranians in Olympic Games, the code name for the attack on the centrifuges, or the way we've acted against North Korean missiles, or the way we've acted against the Russians just during the midterm elections. You are worried a little bit that we are spinning into this era without having set any rules for what's off limits. So what's the matter with Cyber Command just stepping in and beginning to act a bit preemptively?
Well, I think that one of the questions that these developments should cause all of us to think about is what rules do we want to see for the 21st century? It's like anything, you have shades of gray, and then you end up with things happening that probably would cause everyone great concern. And I'll be the first to say that what causes me or us the most concern actually isn't what the US government is likely to do. It's what other governments, especially certain governments, are likely to do. But everybody lives in the same world. And we especially live in a world where if the US government does something, it creates a precedent that almost every other government will feel comfortable following. This kind of persistence may be one thing, but when you have countries go farther and actually attack civilians, then you really live in a very different world. To us, one of the important lessons of the 20th century was what emerged from World War II. It's a war that led to 60 million people losing their lives. It was a war that led to many, many more civilian casualties because of how weapons had expanded. And so one of the things that the world did after World War II was come together in 1949, really under the auspices of the International Committee for the Red Cross, with strong support from the United States. Every country in the world agreed to what is known as the Fourth Geneva Convention. And what that convention says is that even in a time of war, governments have not just a moral responsibility, but a legal duty to try to keep civilians safe. And of course, like every rule in the history of warfare, it's not always followed. But I think most people would say that it has kept more civilians safe and the world is better because it exists. That was 1949. Now go to 2017. You saw in May a North Korean attack, the WannaCry attack I referred to, and I think it's fair to say that civilians were the intended victims of that attack. On that day, a Friday, one of the stories we tell the story of a man named Patrick Ward, lives in the south of England. He was in St. Bartholomew's Hospital about to undergo heart surgery when this hospital that literally had been open since the year 1123, it had never closed during the bombings of World War II, was suddenly brought to its knees by the WannaCry attack. 1/3 of all of the hospitals in the National Health Service in the UK stopped operating. And then just 6 weeks later, in Ukraine, there was a Russian attack, codenamed now NotPetya, that disabled 10% of all of the computers in Ukraine. And then there too, it was really civilians that were the intended targets. It was television stations, it was banks, it was mothers or fathers trying to pay for groceries with a credit card or withdraw cash from an automated teller machine. All these things stopped working. And so, from our perspective, you don't necessarily know in advance where exactly you might draw every line. You might say, well, some kinds of persistence might be appropriate, but intentional attacks on civilians using cyber weapons, that feels like a big step backwards. We ought to have rules that put those kinds of things off limits.
But if we had those rules, Brad, let's say that you and I sat down over a beer and we tried to make a little list of things we'd have off limits. So we'd say power grids, okay? Election systems. Anybody here want to sign up for making election systems off limits? Emergency communications. We could go on with our list. My guess is, I'm absolutely certain, the US government would be very resistant to signing up.
Well, let me just take election systems, because I think that one is really important. And one of the stories we share in the book is the creation last November of what's called the Paris Call for Trust and Security in Cyberspace. An agreement that has now been a declaration that has now been signed by 67 governments, as well as more than 130 civil society organizations and more than 300 companies, including Microsoft.
But
not the United States.
Not the United States and not India, right?
Correct. But 27 of the 29 NATO allies, all of them except Turkey and the US, certainly all 28 member states of the European Union, as well as Canada, South Korea, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, I could go on and on. But just take that proposition. Should we, as a country committed to democracy, sign up for the principle and indeed the rule that governments should not use cyber technology to try to disrupt voting, to try to interfere with voting, to try to falsify voting? I'll argue that we should. It's part of the fundamental principles and freedoms that I think define us as a nation. I don't think that we as a country actually are going to use cyber technology to seek to tamper with or falsify the votes in an election.
Probably not, Brad, but you could imagine somebody coming into a president and saying to them, sir, if we don't interfere in this election in country X, you're going to get another Maduro-like figure out there. And we may end up having to go to war. Much cheaper to go do this. If you make electrical grids off limits, well, we have a plan called the codename Nitro Zeus to turn off all of Iran, because it would be more humane to turn off their power than to bomb them if we got into an actual war. So there would be significant resistance to limiting future presidents' choices here, don't you think?
It's why one needs to think through the specifics. I will argue that it is not, on balance, a good idea to legitimize interference in elections because an election might produce in another country a leader we don't like. Because I believe, among other things, right now, attacks on elections are giving an asymmetric advantage to the authoritarian countries of the world. They don't have to worry about having free and open elections. And it has become so easy to use internet-based technologies to interfere in our political process that it's really putting the democratic nations of the world at a disadvantage. I'd also then say, that doesn't answer every question. You might say, well, what about turning off the electrical grid if there is war? Well, that's a different situation. What about having a preemptive attack that would turn off an electrical grid? There might be situations even under the United Nations Charter as it exists today where you could imagine that that would be justified. So I'm not here to say that the answer to one question will give you the answer to every question. But I'll also say, again, think about where we are. There were people who said we shouldn't have an additional nuclear arms agreement with the Soviet Union. There were people who said that President Reagan shouldn't have gone to Reykjavik. There were people who didn't applaud when, towards the end of the 1980s, there was a tremendous breakthrough and there were new arms control agreements. All international agreements that govern the use of arms, by definition, restrict the freedom of action of the countries that sign them. And yet and all such agreements have the risk of violation. That's why, President Reagan was, I think, right to say it's trust but verify, and it's why attribution in the context of cyber attacks are so important. At the end of the day, there are risks associated with agreements. I'll argue there are even greater risks if cyberspace becomes the one plane of warfare that is completely lawless, that becomes the new Wild West, that it's sort of on the verge on certain days of becoming right now.
Well, Brad, one of the great things about Tools and Weapons is you tell some great Wild West stories. And I want to return you briefly before we go to some questions from the audience to one of the stories that you made reference to, WannaCry. So WannaCry was a North Korean attack that, as you point out, hit the British healthcare system, in part because the healthcare system was using a very old and not still supported version of a Microsoft Windows program, XP, right? And they hadn't spent the money to upgrade, and as a result, they were very vulnerable. But the interesting thing is that a few weeks before that attack happened, you had an interesting call from the NSA that you talk about in the book. And they had to mention to you that they had lost something. Tell us a little bit about that, because it relates to what became WannaCry.
This is one of the reasons it's always interesting doing these things with David Sanger, because he's able, as a New York Times reporter, to print information that's classified. It's why, in certain instances, actually, if you read the book carefully, it quotes David Sanger. So to quote David Sanger, what the New York Times reported in 2017 was that the WannaCry attack and the NotPetya attack that followed it in June used this code, Eternal Blue, that was developed by the National Security Agency. And it was code that was designed to exploit a vulnerability, according to David Sanger, that the NSA had discovered in certain versions of Microsoft Windows. And interestingly, there was a story that ran in the Washington Post in May of 2017 as well, that, I'll just be clear, I have no big way to know whether it's true or not, but what the Post reported was that when the NSA staff identified this vulnerability 5 years earlier, they recognized that it was potentially so serious that there was quite a debate about whether to keep it and use it or whether to inform Microsoft about it so we could patch and fix it. And the reason there was such a debate was because they recognized that if they ever lost control of it, the consequences would be potentially quite substantial for the computers of the world. And then to sort of talk about the obvious, as you've reported, David, they kept it, they used it, they lost it, and North Korea used it and launched an attack.
But
on the world.
you wrote a blog, though, when they came to you to go fix this. I mean, it's perfectly fine to blame the New York Times for publishing all this, but we learned about a lot of this from the blog you wrote.
Well, one of the things we said in the blog, which also basically referred to the story you had published 2 days earlier, was, as we said, that the equivalent would be the Pentagon losing control of its Tomahawk missiles. And our basic argument was, first of all, we have a point of view, as do most tech companies, that at least most of the time we would actually, we would vastly prefer that if the government identifies these vulnerabilities, they inform tech companies so we can solve the problem rather than have the vulnerability exploited by a government. But if they're not going to share the information, if they're going to create code that exploits the vulnerability, oh my gosh, please keep that secure. Don't let it fall into the wrong hands. And at one level, people can look at that and say, well, that seems so weird. You're comparing, some code that you can put on like a thumb drive, a USB stick, to a Tomahawk missile. But just think about the damage that can be caused when that code falls into the wrong hands and can impact computers in 150 countries in a day. It's actually a lot harder to keep control of it, and I'd argue it's just as important, maybe it's even more important to keep control of it.
When I used the Tomahawk missile example on the front page of the Times, I also noted that if you had been a military officer and you lost a Tomahawk missile and it got fired back on an ally like Great Britain, there would be court-martials, there would be public investigations. But there's something about cyber where the realm of secrecy that is wrapped in it meant that nobody was actually held accountable for the fact that the NSA, having held on to this thing for 5 years, lost it somehow, and it got fired back on an ally.
It really, I think, touches upon something that's true of every aspect of our book. And the book is not just obviously about cyber weapons and military issues, but about privacy and other aspects of cybersecurity, about the impact of digital technology on the economy, jobs, the relationship with China. Something that we've long experienced in the tech sector. You can't see it. You can see your phone, you can see your laptop, but you can't see the code. You can see a rifle, you can see a missile, you can see a bomber, but you can't see digital technology. And it makes it harder, I think, to talk about. It makes it harder to think through in terms of the implications. It actually makes it harder for governments, or for tech companies for that matter, to fashion principles and policies to govern all of this technology. But given the ubiquitous impact of this technology in the world today, it's more important than ever that we overcome that difficulty. It's one of the reasons so often in the book we use historical analogies, because I think you can learn a lot from these historical insights. But it's more than just learning from the historical insights. When you can take those and then put present day issues around software in that context, it just makes it easier for all of us to start to think, more clearly about what we might want to do to solve these problems.
Well, we could go on doing this all night, and there have been some nights where we have. But we wanted to get to some of your questions. There are people in the audience, there are people walking around here with microphones. So if you've got a question, raise your hand and tell us who you are and try to ask as crisp a question to Brad as we can. Right back there, ma'am.
You said you have all this cybersecurity and you can track all these things. What keeps companies and the government from using it against everybody? If you've got
Using it against?
Against people. I mean, you've got all this code that you can track all this cyber stuff, but if you can track all that stuff on people's computers, then you can track the computers and come, do something. I'm not sure what.
This is a great question because just today, Brad, you saw the U.S. government, along with two of its allies, stand up and make an argument for more access into encrypted data, and which is the one way that people try to keep some of their transactions private.
Well, I think it's a great question, and as with so many things, there are often two sides of the coin to be considered. But first, I think the side to be thought about is that, in fact, in the world today, there is a growing risk that code, that cyber technology, can and is being used, especially by authoritarian governments, to repress people. You're seeing facial recognition used in parts of the world to follow people around, to discourage people from exercising their civil liberties. The year 2019 has been a watershed year, a year of firsts for many things. One of the firsts is that people have been showing up to protest in public places in Hong Kong wearing gas masks, not solely to protect themselves from tear gas, but to make it more difficult for cameras connected to facial recognition services to identify who they are and catalog who they are and what they're doing. And so, I think that the first answer to your question is the only thing that will stop governments from using this technology, like many other technologies, to oppress people is the kind of rights that we have in a country like ours in the Bill of Rights and the Constitution that we've long had. And then the laws that are passed by the people we elect to make those kinds of rights effective. And it makes it more important, in my view, than ever to have the kind of conversations that really connect the democracies of the world to the principles that are needed to keep people's rights secure. And I think it's worth reflecting that in the world today, there are 76 nations that are classified as democracies by a group like The Economist magazine. About half the world's people live in them. And so even then, you still have half the world living somewhere else. I just don't see how we can offer any hope for the other half of the world if we don't have the democracies of the world continuing to stand up for these freedoms. And then, of course, there is the other side. We do need governments to be able to access digital information, data, to keep us safe, to investigate crimes, to thwart terrorist activities. So it's never an all or nothing. If it were, this would be at least a simple conversation. It's more complicated in part because data is everywhere and it is fundamental both to protecting us and protecting our rights, and to enabling governments to thwart threats to public safety as well.
Right back here. Yes.
Thank you for a very meaningful discussion. Good to see you again, Eva Blaisdell. When we met first time, I was general manager of Compaq in Munich, taking our American technology forward when the wall collapsed. So it's great to see you writing this particular book. I left earthy doings and I am now space entrepreneur. and I am also launching international space media dedicated to importance of space. My question to you has to do with the importance of space, cybersecurity, and safety. And I will just add, it's particularly important to us in this room because we are awaiting a decision of Mark Esper, Secretary of Defense, on where Space Command is going to be located. Vandenberg Air Force Base, which was particularly important to President Reagan, is one of the 6 places. So possible is that we'll be using a lot of Microsoft around this area to implement space cyber security for American Space Force. Would welcome comments from both of you gentlemen.
Well, I have to say that it's definitely not one of the areas that I am as expert in as cyber space. Outer space is not. What I guess I would say is that because of the nature of digital technology, it ends up changing every other plane of war. And I think it's a time when we need to be thinking about how to use artificial intelligence across the United States military, in ways that will keep this nation more secure, safe. I think it is a time when we need to be also imposing the kinds of principles that don't enable machines to start a war without human accountability and control. And as cyber technology, it not only moves more into combat on land and in the sea and in the air, if it's going to move into space, I'll argue that we need a world that has some controls so that all the work we do to try to address these cyber issues on Earth doesn't escape us once we have weapons that are in outer space as well. You may have better thoughts than me.
I would just pick up on one thing that you mentioned there, which was keeping humans in the loop. And I think there's a great temptation, and it's the official policy of the US military to keep humans in the loop. There was a really interesting article written a couple of weeks ago by 2 military officers in a military journal that basically said, let's not kid ourselves. I'm putting this in sort of more colloquial words than it was, but we are going to head to a world in which artificial intelligence is going to mean that decisions about the use of weapons, the decision space, the time is going to be diminished greatly. That the anti-missile systems that are at Vandenberg won't be terribly useful because they'll be up against hypersonic missiles that move much faster and are maneuverable. And you're going to need AI systems to defend yourself and to make decisions about the response because you're not going to have time to have that meeting in the Situation Room. And they were basically arguing that for all we talk about keeping humans in the loop, we're not going to be able to afford to take the time to do that.
I think that there's something to that, but I would also argue that what you're describing is not entirely new. Once you had jet aircraft and nuclear bombs, and especially once you had intercontinental ballistic missiles that could be fired by submarines that were 50 miles offshore, you entered that world. You couldn't have a very long meeting, and we all recognize that. So we've been dealing with this shortening of time, and I think it's right that it is a matter of great concern. It does deserve more discussion as to how we're going to manage this. I guess I take a little bit of comfort out of the fact that if humanity has accomplished nothing else since World War II, we have managed to avoid destroying ourselves, even though we had the capability to do so once nuclear weapons were invented. And so, to me, there's a lesson to be learned from that. Whenever technology increases the impact of weapons and shortens the time for decisions to be made by governments in response to one another, it makes it more important to have broad discussions when you're not at war, when these attacks are not imminent, to establish common rules of the road and common understandings. and, and hope that we'll continue to have leaders of countries that will ensure that reason prevails. So that would be my one thought on that.
Gentleman right here. The mic coming to you. Hold on just 1 minute.
A couple of years ago, the FBI really needed Apple to crack an iPhone to get some evidence. I don't know whether Apple could or wouldn't. Would you address that from the corporate point of view, whether Apple did or, you know what I want to ask. Should they, could they, and should they, could they?
And you'll remember in the end, the government ended up hiring an Israeli firm that they paid a little over $1 million to crack the Apple.
Well, it's interesting. The Manhattan District Attorney, Cyrus Vance, had his 10th annual conference this week in Manhattan about cybersecurity issues, and he brings together, not just the New York City Police Department, but people from the FBI across the country. Actually, there were people from 10 countries there, and I participated in the discussion in New York. I think it was just the day before yesterday. And what his report showed was, first, there's an increasing frequency that, say, the New York City Police Department and more broadly police departments around the country end up possessing the smartphones of people under arrest, criminal suspects, and without the ability to unlock them. Because that kind of encryption has been turned on by default for both the iPhone and the Android phone now for about 5 years. The first thing I would say is there's a very interesting data paradox that is probably worthy of more discussion. We will start the new decade with 25 times as much digital data on this planet as we did in the year 2010. And so, what you sometimes have is the tech sector and law enforcement sort of talking past each other. The law enforcement says, we have more phones that we can't unlock than ever before. And then the tech sector says, yes, but look at all of this other digital data that you can get access to without unlocking the phone. Maybe you don't really need to unlock it in the first place.
Data they hadn't been invented, didn't have any access to 15 years ago.
And mostly I just make that point to say that it underscores something that is, in my view, important. I don't think you usually solve problems when people are talking past each other. You've got to get people to sort of meet in a room and start to share these perspectives. And this is a paradox of having more data available, but also more data that's unavailable than ever before. The second thing that Cy Vance's report this year showed was really interesting. Okay, what do you do about the smartphone that law enforcement does sometimes really need to access? It said there's basically 3 ways. One is you can hire a firm to do what was done with the Apple phone after the San Bernardino attack. You hire a firm to break the encryption. And the report acknowledges that that's possible. It's also expensive. So if you have a high profile, really important case, and you actually need the data, it can be done, but it doesn't scale. So that's the pro and con of that one. The second option, interestingly enough, I think would benefit from a lot more discussion with people in technology and people in law enforcement. You can seek to compel a suspect to enter the PIN or put their thumb or finger and unlock an iPhone. In this country, we're sort of familiar with you can plead the Fifth. You have this Fifth Amendment right so as to not testify against yourself. But there's 3 states in the country now where cases are moving forward, and the basic argument is that your Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination is not really being impinged, because all you're really being required to do is surrender information, not testify against yourself. And this may carry the day. I mean, this will be a case that we'll all be reading about. It will get to the United States Supreme Court probably in the next 3 to 5 years. That's a second means. And then the third means is to basically create a technical capability so that if the suspect can't be compelled to enter the PIN, if it's too expensive to retain a firm, you can, with a search warrant or proper legal process, go to the tech company and compel the tech company to unlock the phone. And yeah, the counter argument that Apple made in the San Bernardino case is, please don't compel us to create that kind of technology, because if we have to create it somewhere, it will be available everywhere, and it will be used not only by a government like the American government that will act pursuant to a lawful search warrant, but by authoritarian governments as well, and it will take people's rights backwards. And to me, what all of this really reflects is, we do, I think, live in a world where we want law enforcement to have access to the information it needs to pursue criminals. I think we also live in a world, I would argue, where we want people's fundamental privacy rights to be protected. And the only way then to figure out how to resolve this tension between these two important principles and goals is actually to start talking a little bit more about the variety of approaches that can be taken, the pros and cons of each of them, the unintended consequences of certain approaches. We've been comfortable as a company saying we really don't want to see back doors created to technology because of the risks that we think that will create for people's privacy rights. But I think that this is reaching a point where we need to have I'll just say a more comprehensive conversation that gives people some opportunity to listen to each other and not just talk past each other. Otherwise, we're just going to keep going in circles.
Well, we are running low on time, but we still have some hands here, so I'm going to take just 2 or 3 together, and then Brad will figure out which ones he wants to answer. So we're going to start with you, ma'am, and then you can hand the mic back right behind over there.
Hello, thank you for being here. I am a mother of 3, 6 through 10, and as a parent, I often think, what is the future going to hold for our kids, right? And observing my children, it's very interesting nowadays on the YouTubes and everything that they get on. I see there is this world in which I need to know more about. Yeah. So knowledge, understanding, more knowledge of cybersecurity is very much intrigued me lately, to a point where I want to get into it even. So where do you see with all of this, as far as parents, what is their role? What will their role be in the future?
Great question, and if you hand it back there.
George Gilder talks about the crypto networks, and I was wondering how you felt about that as far as the increased security and maybe even trust and the overall impact that it could have on the ability, the hacking ability, and those types of things.
We'll grab one more right back here.
Hi, Mr. Smith and Mr. Sanger. Thank you for the wonderful talk. So being a freshman in college, I noticed a lot of us in my generation just being on our phones, a lot of the time other sorts of technology. So what advice would you give to children around the world on using technology to enhance personal relationships instead of commodifying them?
Mm-hmm. Great.
I think that
two great family-related questions.
No, I think
and
that's
a great
fantastic.
Crypto question.
Briefly on the crypto one, and then I'll turn to the other two. Look, I think certain cryptographic approaches to financial transactions, to all kinds of other transactions, hold a lot of good potential for the world. They can better protect security. They can protect against corruption risks when it comes to the auditing of books and records. There's a lot of benefits that will come out of this. And that's why technologies like blockchain hold such promise and are really taking off. At the same time, I think it's a good illustration of the point we basically make in our book, every tool can be a weapon. And if they're not regulated in a particular way, if there's no sense of responsibility by the companies that are creating or using it, they can also be deployed to facilitate terrorists transferring money, to facilitate financial crimes. And so, I think broadly speaking, we want these technologies to advance, but we do want them to be governed by certain laws, to be regulated in certain ways. That's a broad theme in our book as a whole. I think the other two questions are really fascinating, and they belong together. And whenever you write a book, you sort of ask yourself, who am I writing it for? Carol Ann and I talked a lot about that. We debated it. Is this a book for policy specialists? Is it a book, for technology geeks? What we decided, actually, we wrote it for you. No, we wrote it for most people, because most people are not techno geeks or lawyer specialists. They're just people whose lives and families are being changed by digital technology. And we sort of asked ourselves then, what are the questions that really matter to people or should matter to people? One of the questions was, are we creating a future we're going to be able to control? I think that's the fundamental question around a lot of these cybersecurity issues. It's the fundamental question that we basically pose around artificial intelligence and ethics. And I think it's right that we wrote the book to make it easy for people to read through stories, to start to think about how, from a family perspective or the perspective of our collective future, we ensure that actually we do have technology that is controlled by the population, by parents, by governments, especially those that are democratically elected. I think a second question that we spend a lot of time thinking about is, are we creating a future that is going to have jobs for our children? Is the future going to have jobs for your children as they get older? What are these jobs going to look like? And that's why we talk a lot about how artificial intelligence is changing jobs, what kinds of skills are going to be needed by not just our kids, but ourselves as our jobs change. And also really trying to learn from the technology changes of the past. We spend a fair amount of time just sort of showing how the change from the horse to the automobile had this unbelievable impact across the economy, and we need to think about those lessons and apply them to our future. And then there was a third question that I think speaks to what both of you are asking. It's one that I still remember Carol Ann posing as we were brainstorming one day. Are we going to create a future that we actually want to live in? Are we going to be comfortable living in this future? And I think that speaks very strongly to the way people are using technology today. When you work for a tech company, you're excited about creating technology. That's why you go to work for a tech company. But one of the things that we highlight is that every technology that has ever been invented to bring people together who live far apart has also had the impact of separating people who live close together. We talk about how the automobile changed rural America. They made it possible for people to go from town to town, but once they could leave town, guess what? They didn't spend as much time in town. They didn't spend as much time in their local church or their local school. And then we talk about the impact of the telephone, the landline telephone. I was a teenager in the 1970s. That was a decade when it became affordable for a middle-income family like mine to put a telephone in the bedrooms of the teenage kids. And so suddenly having to go to your bedroom at 8:30 at night was like, this is great, I can call my friends. And I think that's what a lot of us experienced. But what it meant, I remember my father complaining that the hallway with our bedrooms looked like a hotel. All the doors were closed, all the people were in their rooms. We were all talking to people, or at least when we won the fight with the siblings to use the phone to call our friends, we didn't talk to each other as much. I think there may come a time when people in the future will look back at a photograph of the year 2019, and they may think it looks a little odd. They may see 2 parents and 3 kids all sitting around a couch together, all looking at these little screens. And they may reflect on the fact that all of these people were interacting oftentimes with information from halfway around the world. Maybe they were talking to their friends by text message. All these people are sitting right next to each other, and no one is talking to each other. And yeah, I think it's that aspect of technology being both a tool and a weapon, even if it's not, you know, a weapon in the literal sense, that we all need to think more about. And ultimately, you know, we just have to ensure that technology serves people and serves timeless values rather than just sweeps over all of us and all of the values that we care about like some giant tsunami. And that's, in a sense, the broader conversation that we wrote the book to try to encourage. It has to be a broad conversation because it impacts everybody, but everybody can participate only if the information, the knowledge about what is happening and the issues that are being created are really accessible to everybody. So I guess that's just a long way of my saying, thank you for spending a bit of your Friday evening here. You could be anywhere, including looking at your smartphone on the couch at home. We really hope that this kind of conversation and the kinds of things that we put together will help all of us have the conversations we need to have. So thank you.
And